Welcome back, listeners. Today we have a very special episode as we are doing a classic. And today we're talking about Silence of the Lambs from 1991. Now, this received an 8.6 on an Internet Movie Database and a 95% critic score and audience score on Rotten Tomatoes.
You spook easily, Starling?
Not yet, sir.
I'll help you catch him, Clary.
Tell me what you see.
He's got real physical strength, combined with an older man's self-control. He's cautious, precise, and he's never impulsive. He'll never stop.
So the synopsis is, a young FBI cadet must receive the help of an incarcerated and manipulative cannibal killer to help catch another serial killer, a madman who skins his victims. This is starring Jodie Foster and Sir Anthony Hopkins and was directed by Jonathan Demme, and the soundtrack is by Howard Shore. If that has any significance to you, he did the Lord of the Rings movies. Now, this, of course, is the first in the series, was based on a novel.
Yeah, by Thomas Harris, yeah.
But is actually, Red Dragon is the novel before this novel, correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
And then this spawned the sequel Hannibal, Red Dragon, Hannibal Rising, and there's also a very good TV series also called Hannibal, starring Mads Mikkelsen. So we're going to try not to spoil anything from Silence of the Lambs in case you've not seen it.
I'll try not to spoil anything.
For good luck, we have Hannibal Lecter, the Funko Pop, resting on Leatherface Lee's microphone. And we have a special guest today to help us break down Silence of the Lambs, and this was her pick. This is Maddie the Mass Murderer Lemke, which she goes by casually in her private life.
Yeah.
So I was in no way surprised that you chose this film, because when I think of the person who I know who knows the most about serial killers of anyone I know, it's Maddie. And I actually know quite a few people who know a lot about serial killers, so that is saying something. So before we talk about the film, I'm just curious, what got you interested in serial killers in the first place?
I was always kind of into like the morbid things. Like when I was
pretty morbid.
Yeah, right? When I was like a child, I'd watch like Mayday videos of like plane crashes and stuff. My mom had to like cut off my internet access because she was like worried for like my mental health. But and then what was like the first story I read about was like Ted Bundy, and I got it from a book at a public library, and I started reading about Ted Bundy. I'm like, oh, this is pretty cool. And then I just started like watching more videos, and I think it definitely peaked when I was probably like in grade 8, and I was like, this is cool.
You're a peak serial killer in grade 8?
Peak serial killer in grade 8. And, when I started taking psychology class and I started learning about the psychology behind it, that made it even more interesting to me. So then I was just like deep dove into it.
Yeah.
Like Maddie would come to class first saying like, hey, Mr. Vincent, have you heard about this serial killer? And you'd go on this big thing, and I hadn't heard of them. And you had so many like obscure, crazy ones. And I even gave them a quiz, like an online quiz one day about serial killers. And you just destroyed everybody.
Yeah.
So you're the perfect person to come on and talk about perhaps the prototypical serial killer film, Silence of the Lambs.
And I don't know if you need to feel better. I totally get, because I actually don't talk particularly to my wife because she thinks it's a bit weird. But I do think it's fascinating. I think the psychology behind like what drives a person to like what creates a serial killer, how they choose their victims, but also how they manipulate their victims. Like we hear so many stories about serial killers that were, oh, he was so nice and he was, the guy next door. And that's the fascinating bit to me, right? Is every story you hear or every one that you look at is slightly different, but they all have similarities in common. And it's pretty fascinating. I get it.
Yeah, and I even wonder if this film is responsible for a lot of people's interest in serial killers, as this kind of spawned like that whole like 10-year span of serial killer films. Like clearly this hit a nerve with people, and I think sparked a lot of interest in serial killers.
100%. I think the most interesting thing is how they justify it.
Yeah.
That's like the part that gets me like super excited.
So Ted Bundy is he's the one who got it all started.
Ted Bundy. We all owe it to Ted Bundy.
And if you're into serial killers, there's so many series on Netflix these days, like like there really seems to be a craze about serial killers. Like it seems like each one has their own Netflix series now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Totally.
Which I've not actually seen all of them, but you've seen a lot of them, it sounds like.
Yeah, definitely. I think the best one was probably the one on Jeffrey Dahmer, which is like also like that's a very controversial topic because it created a lot of problems, especially with the victims' families, because the show was so real.
Yes, totally.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think it was Evan Peters.
That's right. Yeah.
He did he said that it scarred him doing that performance because he had to dig so deep and find all those dark bits in him and pull them out because he was incredible.
Yeah,
So I had
true
to,
play a role
look
like that.
twice a couple times. Well, when it first came out, because I didn't recognize Evan Peters at first.
Yeah.
And then it was like, oh, I know him from American Horror Story.
American Horror Story, yeah.
And yeah, I couldn't believe how good. I haven't seen. There was another true crime kind of documentary thing on Dahmer that came out around the same time, which I've seen that one, but I haven't seen the Peters one. But I've heard really good things.
It's on the list. Maybe I'll have to review that at some point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Question for you. What's your experience with seeing this for the first time? Did you see this when it came out in 1991?
I was trying to remember that because I was just finishing university and I don't think I saw this in theaters. I think it would have been a VHS release after. You remember those are those big tapes that
Yeah,
they have these little reels inside and the film moves. So I think it would have been. I think probably when I started teaching. There was a local video store or whatever. That's probably the first time I would have seen it because I don't recall a theater experience for this.
And do you remember the impact it had on you on the time?
Well, it's interesting because I was into horror already at that point. And I think the year before, this is 91, I think 1990, or is it? Anyway, I'm trying to remember that when I bought the 25th anniversary of The Exorcist, the VHS.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So I was already a huge horror fan. And of course, this one isn't, well, in the days that it came out, it wasn't marketed the same way. It was marketed as a thriller, not as a horror.
Interesting.
Because horror was B-movie, schlock. This is elevated horror, and I hate that term.
Before that became a term. I
Totally,
guess, yeah.
right? Yeah, so I definitely remember seeing this, and there were scenes when I rewatched it last week. There were scenes that I remember, the locker scene. I remember that one really impacting me. And of course, my wife hates it when I do that. She goes, shut up. I hate that sound. So there were just things that really stuck with me. The Miggs scene at the beginning. I didn't actually get that until maybe the second or third time. I'm like, what does he say? And I mean, she says what he says, but
I didn't remember that either until this viewing of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really, so yeah, there are some really good scenes. And there were things, because I was watching this less for entertainment, but more critically this time, there were some things that really, I mean, the music for one, that I can't listen to Tom Petty without thinking of the scene in this movie. It sticks with, and that's a good thing, but it's something that stuck with me for sure.
Yeah, because my first exposure to this film, I think I was 8 years old. And I remember my parents making a big deal. Like, we're having friends over tonight and we're watching this movie called Silence of the Lambs. So you better stay in your room and you better not come down, because we used to kind of sneak out and half watch movies. Like, you will be traumatized if you come down and watch this film. So this movie made an impression early on, even though I didn't watch it until I was much older, but just my parents talking about it the next day and oh yeah, there's this really graphic scene where he bites somebody's face, and they just pitched it as you better stay in your room. This is gonna be a dark experience. So that really stood out to me. And what made you choose this film? And what was your introduction to this? Because you're obviously a little bit younger than we are.
Yeah, so actually you mentioned the movie to me in psychology class.
I was wondering that.
Yeah, and then I remember I was with a friend and we were staying above a barn, and we were in a loft of a barn, and it was super dark and creepy out. And we're we need to watch some sort of borderline creepy movie. And then I was like, oh, Silence of the Lambs. And I was like, okay, let's watch that. And I didn't think that it was going to be too creepy, because it's a serial killer. Usually serial killer stuff doesn't creep me out.
Yes.
And it creeped me out the first time watching it, especially alone with a friend in a dark loft above a barn, Yeah, I just remember, I think the whole, again, no spoilers, the whole movie kind of stood out to me. And I think that it's definitely a special movie, for sure. Yeah. And then the second time I watched it, and the third time this morning at 5:30 a.m.
It's dedication.
I think that, again, I started picking up on smaller things, but I also just couldn't help myself from sitting down and just enjoying the movie,
Yeah, I mean, in the third act, especially the final scene, is just, I mean, that, to me, I've seen it 6 or 7 times easily. never get tired of it. It stands up every time I watch it. Even when I know what's coming, it still stands up to me. It's so well made. It's so tightly made. The performances are so good. I never tire of this film.
Yeah, and I think especially like the chemistry and the dynamic between Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins is just so good. I don't know if anything else about the film stands out too much. Like it's all solid, but I don't remember there being any like breathtaking cinematography or and the soundtrack is good, but I feel like it's their chemistry and their performances, a few other things which we'll talk about later, but they're just both incredible.
Yeah.
And I always kind of was like, oh yeah, Anthony Hopkins so good. And this time I really noticed Jodie Foster, and she was so good.
Absolutely.
I was really impressed with her because I hadn't seen it in quite a few years. As I've appreciated film more, this might be the first time I've watched it in a while. So
this isn't spoiler territory for sure, but we can pick up on this again later because I hadn't heard until probably in the last year or two an interview with her, a little snippet about making this film. And part of the chemistry is that she was terrified of Anthony Hopkins.
Really?
Terrified by like his stature?
Partly
like intimidated or actually terrified of him?
Terrified because he didn't speak to her on set.
Oh,
and that scene, she said there's a scene where she's interviewing him and he makes fun
of her accent. I read that, yeah.
And she said she was so nervous. That's not acting because she was nervous about doing that accent. And he picked up on it right away, and that was unscripted.
Yeah, he ad-libbed that.
He ad-libbed that. And she said it just terrified her. And he maintained a distance. She said he was lovely. Like there was no... he's not
doing that to be a dick.
No.
He's doing that to elevate her performance.
Yeah. There was no shade that she was throwing on Anthony Hopkins, just that he maintained a distance. And of course, they were filming between glass, the interview scenes early in the movie. And she said it was that whole thing really threw her for a loop. And she was a fairly young actress.
Good for her, though. She did kind of roll with it, it sounds like, and it did affect her performance.
So that really interested me when I heard that, because of course, you watch films and you think, oh, actors do their thing. And I've seen horror movie, behind the scenes, and it's all fun and games and whatever. But that didn't seem to be the case with this film. And I think that's part of what we experience as an audience is that tension is real.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I wonder to what extent the director needs to be in on that. Like, can you just do that kind of stuff, or do you have to check it with the director first? Like, hey, I'm going to do these things to try and get in her head or elevate her performance.
And I wonder if somebody of Hopkins' stature can do that, or maybe, have a conversation with the director and say, hey, this is what I was thinking. And I was hearing something, and I'm not going to remember who it is, but something recently about another actor who did that on set and just remained very aloof. But
Nicolas Cage, I think.
Probably, because he's so good.
Renfield.
Because it was for a specific reason, because of what his character was doing on set. And he wanted, I know what it was. Have you seen that? I've seen it many times, that interview with, it was about Leonardo DiCaprio not wanting to say the N-word.
Oh.
And it was...
Oh, and... yeah,
exactly.
Okay. Yeah, I'll think of it.
See, I'm old.
The slavery one.
Yeah.
Django Unchained.
Yeah, and it was
I could Google it.
Jamie Foxx.
Oh, Jamie Foxx.
Thank you.
Yeah, is it Jamie Foxx?
Yes, it is.
Oh.
I'm going to edit all that out. It's Jamie Foxx. So Jamie Foxx is in an interview, and he said Leonardo DiCaprio is having a hard time saying the N-word. Jamie Foxx, how he tells the story is just basically, hey, it's just another Thursday. We're not friends. I'm your property. You have to do this. So he said the next day when he came on set, he says, DiCaprio comes in and he goes, hey man, how's it going? Just walks right by him.
Wow.
Didn't say a word. And then when the scene comes and he has to say the N-word, didn't hesitate at all. And just had got into that mindset of, I'm not your friend, you're my property. And so I just think I don't say this lightly, I just think there's a game that you can play with yourself to get yourself in the headspace, particularly if you have to play characters that are pretty nasty. I think you have to do something to get in the headspace. And I also think it's probably helpful, as you already mentioned, for the other actors on set to have some distance so that you're not friendly and then having to do this really horrible scene. It allows you to be in character, I think, right?
That's true. It's like not becoming friends with coworkers if you're in a authority over them or something to avoid
Yeah,
that
totally,
dynamic.
totally.
That would make sense. If I tried to do like a movie with a good friend, I'd just like laugh the whole time, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. You have to maintain that distance, I think. But anyway, a long-winded way to say, yeah, Jodie Foster was throw Ted Levine a bone. He was awesome as Buffalo Bill, but absolutely Hopkins and Jodie Foster, their performances. Scott Glenn, meh.
Yeah.
But those two were so good.
100%. Yeah, what did you think? So as a younger person, was watching a film from 1991, did this feel old, or was there any disconnect there watching an older movie? Was that okay?
No, I think it was okay, but like, you know, I watch like I like older movies.
Okay,
like
yeah.
I watch older movies, you know. I mean, not like, okay, maybe my older movies is not like
Sure,
older
yeah, we'll
movies
put that
for
in
you guys.
context.
Fair enough, yeah.
Is 1991 an older movie?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it would be.
Yeah.
I don't mind, like, you know, so many people get like really picky about even just like the camera quality.
Well, that's
You know
why I
what
ask,
mean?
because some people will just write off a film if it's
Yeah.
like, oh no, that's an old movie.
Mhm.
Like it's almost like that's not worthy of my time. So I was curious if you experienced any of that.
No, like a couple of my favorite movies are definitely like older movies, and I think that I don't know, like I feel like in some scenarios, I think like the acting just feels more real in a way. I don't know. I'm definitely one for older movies.
I think there's something to be said about that. I think in terms of mainstream cinema, like this was a bit of a golden age in some ways when you look at the quality of the actors.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at Hollywood as now as a lot of like, it's another Marvel film or another
Mhm.
comedy. Like it seems like the drama has kind of taken a hit. They don't make as much money, I think, and so you don't see as many of them. But like in this time, like in the 90s, you had like Denzel Washington and Anthony Hopkins and Al Pacino and like there's just so many amazing actors from this time period.
Mm-hmm.
So there might be something too. I've heard some other younger people say that too. Like, oh, I really love older movies being like from the 90s and the 80s because I just think there was a lot of good stuff happening that you don't see now.
I mean, I think that's fair. Like 30 plus years, that's old.
Yep.
That's an old film,
Yep.
right? So I think it's totally fair. Like, I mean, even though I was alive and I was like working as an adult at the time, it's not like watching a film from the 40s or whatever,
No.
right?
Yeah.
But I mean, I do think what's interesting to me is that you had these, if you think about The Omen, The Exorcist, you had some, those were also sometimes called elevated horrors because they had A-list actors. And this is very similar in the sense that you've almost a generation later, because if you consider, yeah, you could probably pick out some higher brow horror films of the 80s, but it was a lot of schlock in the 80s, right? That's certainly the slasher genre's heyday, right? So this almost feels like a bit of a throwback to the 70s where you've got that elevated horror and you've got A-list actors and all the rest of it. And I think that's possibly why it wasn't marketed as a horror film.
Yeah, I mean, you don't hear about good things about horror in the 90s. Like, that just
Exactly.
was a pretty low period for horror generally, except for Scream on your shirt and maybe
Exactly.
this.
Love that movie.
So for you, did something stand out that you particularly liked? Was there anything you didn't like about Silence of the Lambs? Any critiques or beefs?
You know what? Honestly, one of my critiques, and part of this is because I'm used to newer movies, and I feel like newer movies are like quite fast paced. You know what I mean? Like I just watched like the new Scream movie, for example. Like I feel like it was like really fast paced and like stuff started happening like right away. I think this one had a bit of a slow start to it.
Yeah.
In my opinion, I think that it was a bit slow, and then it started getting good, and then it started getting really good. Then it started getting better, and then it finished.
Do you remember
amazing.
when the film grabbed you? Was there a certain scene or?
I think that there was like a few. I think that the first one was probably The Interview.
100%. I was going to say, that's where the movie kind of really
Yeah.
grabs you.
Where you see him for the first time, and I think that like, also I don't think there would have been a better person to play Hannibal. No.
Yeah, it's funny because I mean, when you see an actor in a performance and then you try to imagine could anyone else have done it, they're so iconic that you just think there's no one else who could have done this film like Anthony Hopkins.
Nicolas Cage maybe
maybe
as well as Anthony Hopkins, but no, he's like when I see Anthony Hopkins, I just think of Hannibal Lecter. Like even though he's done quite an eclectic
Absolutely.
amount of roles, but I think that's the one that maybe defines his career.
Yeah, if you said like Hannibal Lecter to me and I'd never watched the movie, I would think of someone that looks like him. Like he just like hit the whole, it feels like watching the movie, it feels like a real character. Like that feels like, it almost feels like that's
convincing.
like a documentary in a sense. You know what I mean?
And how did you feel about him? Because he's interesting. He's kind of a villain, but I find him pretty likable. Like he's a...
Totally. Well,
You
I
don't
do too.
hate him as a villain necessarily. Maybe you do. How do you react to him?
As a lover of serial killers.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So as a lover for serial killers, I really quite liked him actually. I think that he, obviously like, bites people's faces off and everything, but everyone has their flaws.
That's right. Small character flaw. Like no one's perfect.
No one's perfect. I really liked him. I think that he, again, without doing like any spoilers, I think that I liked him. I think that he was probably a really good way of showing how intelligent serial killers can be. And I think that I love when films show that instead of just, there's definitely like, it's definitely a spectrum for sure. But I really like when they show how calculated and smart they are. I read a book.
Good for you. Well done.
Thank you. That's what my mom said. I read a book on how to identify psychopaths.
Oh, I remember you talked about that book.
Yeah. And it was really good. And they said that, like, think of, like, he said, out of everyone you know, who's, like, the smartest person you know, and it's likely they're a psychopath. Not likely, but you know what I mean. Like, they're...
Yeah. More likely.
Yeah, more likely.
Yeah.
Like, there's... I just think that part was portrayed so well. And I also think that probably sparked a lot of interest for people in serial killers because of how intelligent he was, well-spoken he was, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the juxtaposition between him as a serial killer and Buffalo Bill, because he's the more like deranged kind of psychotic serial killer, whereas he's very put together. He's a doctor. He's very articulate.
Yeah.
He knows a lot. He's talking about Marcus Aurelius and like he's very well read. So it's kind of interesting, the two spectrums as we think of serial killers.
And it's, you know what, now they, like, it's cool that they had both of those, like the two ends of the spectrum in one film.
Yeah.
So you can kind of compare it, You got like, like the messy, I feel like Buffalo Bill's kind of messy. I feel like he definitely
in a very unkempt apartment, I thought.
Yeah, and I also think he could have probably, like, got away with it a bit more. But I think it's really interesting. And then, not going to spoil anything, but in the ending, you see how that works out for them. You
That's
know?
right. Yeah, do you sympathize? Are you rooting for Hannibal Lecter in this movie, do you think?
I don't know if rooting would be the right word, but I feel very similarly. Like his intellect is very alluring. It's very difficult for me, it's very difficult to demonize him because I love his intellectualness and I'm drawn to that. I find it very attractive. And so it's like, okay, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, I mean, it's a flaw.
And she is too, I think. Like she is very drawn to him. And that comes across, yeah.
And I just think it seems, I mean, yeah, I don't want to spoil anything. It seems to me, though, in the film that she has a similar, not just that she's drawn to him, but she also feels confident that he's not going to come after her for some reason, right? And I think that's perhaps the fascinating thing about serial killers, particularly, I mean, this is a fictional one, but the idea that you're lulled into a sense of confidence about, oh, well, they only go after those people, but you don't actually know that. They're so unpredictable. You might be his taste with some fava beans and some Chianti, right? You just never know. So yeah, I like rooting is maybe not the right word, but I definitely found him attractive and alluring as a character for sure.
And it's one thing to watch this now, maybe when he's become such an iconic character. Seeing it for the first time, you might demonize him a little bit more, see him more as a villain, but it's Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter. He's such a big character now. I think it's more okay to root for him, maybe.
You know what this kind of reminds me of? I think there's a movie, Zac Efron played Ted Bundy.
Oh yeah, okay.
What was that one called? It's a long name. It's horrible, the bad, the
I know which one you mean. I can't think of the title either, but it was a Netflix one.
the
You
horrible.
keep talking, I'll look it up.
And he played Ted Bundy, and in that film, so many people sympathized with Ted Bundy, and it showed like, a lot of people were like, "That's not good."
Extremely wicked, shockingly evil and vile. Is
Yes.
that one? Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
I don't blame you for not remembering that title. word for word.
It's a long one. No, and I feel like it's the same sort of thing where it's like you could look at this as like you could demonize them, or you couldn't. You know what I mean? Like there's definitely like an argue to both of it. 'Cause at the end of the day, serial killers are still human, right?
Well, and Bundy in particular, I mean, over and over and over again, he manipulated and charmed people into even his. I mean, I don't know if they were married or they were just living together, but I think it was his wife. She knew some of the things he was doing, and he could still charm her into, being on his side. And then there's that whole, The Stranger Beside Me, Anne Rule, who the writer, she's since passed away, I think in 2015 or something. But that was her first book. She worked with him on a hotline, a phone-in line, and she couldn't believe. That's one of the reasons she got into writing true crime. She worked with him on this phone-in line, and she couldn't believe that this was the person that she worked with. He was so likable and charming and all the rest of it. And that's, I think there's part of the with Anthony Hopkins is the British accent, is his body language, the way he carries himself. He's very confident. He's very assured. It's very attractive. It draws you in.
Yeah, and she always refers to him as doctor.
Yeah.
Like that's how she addresses him. So even that just gives him like an air of authority.
One of my favorite, I don't know if this is a spoiler. If this is a spoiler, you cut it out. I don't think it is. One of my favorite lines is when, it's close to the end and she's like, well, I don't think he'd come after me because he'd consider that rude.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
And he does say to her at one point, well, when he calls her to congratulate her,
Yeah.
and he says, the world's a more interesting place with you
You in it, yeah.
Right? And that's, it's very... There, can we switch to, because there's some really great lines.
Sure,
in this.
yeah.
Because I love how he, speaking of Lecter, was she a big girl, roomy through the hips? Just how he delivers the lines in some cases are so good.
And knowing that he did a bit of improv, I wonder how much of his lines are written by the script or how much of it was him improvising. I don't know. I know he did some improv, but I'm not sure which lines, but maybe they were actually improvised by him.
Well, for me, one of the creepiest ones, there's the iconic scene with him in the, it looks like an old school hockey mask, right? Where he's talking to the senator.
Oh, yeah. That's
And he's,
Love
and
your
he's
dress.
like, when your daughter's on the slab, where will it tickle you? Right?
Yeah.
Like there's some just really good, like that one in particular, for me, really gets on, because he just goes for the jugular on that one.
Because he's so helpless. Like he's bound.
Sure.
But he is still able to get people just with his words, which I think is super
100%.
cool.
Quid pro quo.
That's right.
Yes or no. And then I loved, and this, I hate to admit this because I've seen this film so many times, and I don't know if I've noticed it before, but this time it really jumped out at me when he's talking to her about the screaming of the lambs.
Yes.
And then, of course, based on the title, he does, I did notice maybe the first or second time that he asks her, is your quest for doing the work that you're doing in the FBI to help silence the lambs? But I don't recall the line screaming of the lambs jumping out at me.
No, I didn't actually. I'd forgotten about that until I rewatched it this time.
Yeah,
the whole
yeah.
screaming of the lambs part. Even the title escaped me when I
Yeah.
watched this time. I'm like, oh yeah, what is the significance?
Yeah,
And you're like, oh,
totally,
okay,
right?
that's interesting. Because actually, most of the symbolism in the movie boils down to moths and cocoons and
Yes.
pupa and stuff. So it's interesting they have that whole line, but then they also have the significance of the lambs.
I really like one of the scenes that I really liked, and I like it every time I see it, is they really set you up where Scott Glenn is talking to the local police when they go investigate a crime. And it's basically a sexist scene, right? Where he says, we shouldn't talk about this, kind of in front of her. And you can see that she's choked by that. But then when she takes control with the local cops and she's got that real kind of South Carolina or whatever drawl, and she's like, hey, I forget how she says it, hey fellas, or, whatever, like, I'm sure the family would appreciate all that you've done for her, but you need to let us take care of her now. And she kind of does almost a bit of mothering for these male officers. And I just thought it was not just a powerful scene for Jodie Foster, but it was also a really powerful scene for the film, that she has more control, more power than some of the men think she does. And I liked that twist.
There's a strong feminist subtext in this film, I think, which I didn't notice as much the first couple times, but there's a lot of that commentary in here, I think.
Yeah.
Being a woman in a
I'd
man's
agree.
world with the FBI.
Absolutely.
Like, there's a lot of gender commentary, which I liked. I had forgotten that was the case. Did you pick up on that?
I think I picked up on that the first time I watched. That was one of the things that stood out most to me about the movie. And I wonder if Lecter actually, I wonder if that was part of the reason why, because I feel like he liked her. I wonder if that was one of the part of the reason why, was because, I feel like she's a very, if I were to meet her, I feel like she's very inspiring in a sense. I don't know.
Yeah, she's strong and resourceful and
Yeah.
tough. And even the opening scene of her is training and doing pretty hardcore physical things.
Yeah.
She comes up with the whole ploy of making the vacation package, was it Plum Island or wherever he was going to go, which turns out was her idea. And just the way she interacts with the police officers, I think she's a really good character.
Well, I do think part of it is her respect for him. Mike mentioned, her calling him doctor and all the rest. But even he, in the first interview scene, where she kind of bumbles along and says, well, maybe you could do this questionnaire. And he's like, no, you were doing so well.
Yeah.
You'd established a connection and you'd done this and you'd done this. That's a ham-fisted way to try to get into this next part. So I feel like I don't know if respect is too strong a word, but I feel like he almost had some mutual admiration and respect for her that she was doing, especially because she was honest with him. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a huge, at least one of the takeaways from his character is, if you are straight with me, if you are honest with me, and of course this is Scott Glenn says, you never let him inside your head.
Yes.
Right? But she knows that's the only way that he's going to know if she's not honest. If she's making something up, he's going to know the
And
difference.
it's the first thing he wants to do, basically.
Absolutely,
He's like, all right, so
right?
tell me about yourself. I thought that was pretty funny.
And she bears her soul a little bit for him, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what, I think he appreciates, that she takes that risk for, with him. And I think she's smart enough to recognize this is the only way this is going to work. If we don't do this quid pro quo, if I don't give him something,
For sure.
I get nothing.
It was effective.
right.
But that's why his characters are so cool. He's the one locked up in a maximum security prison, has nothing going for him, yet he's the one in control.
Totally.
Psychologically of everyone at all times. And that's what makes it really neat.
Now, we talked about characters. I don't know if you came across this in your reading. So Jodie Foster was not the first pick. She was actually the third pick.
Oh, wow. Who was the first pick?
Michelle Pfeiffer
Okay. That's
and
interesting.
Meg Ryan were the top two. Pfeiffer, maybe. Meg Ryan, I could not
Yeah, Meg
see.
Ryan, I'm not sure.
But of course, she was big, right? She had Sleepless in Seattle,
Yep.
and some other, she was hot commodity at this time.
So do we know, did they turn down the roles?
Not sure. I do know, just wrote a note to myself that Demi didn't think Jodie Foster was right for the role, which is why she was not, wasn't first pick. And Sean Connery was first approached for. Can you imagine Sean Connery as Hannibal Lecter?
He kind of has that air to him, but he wouldn't work in this role the same way.
I
I don't
cannot see him work in this role at all.
No.
It would be
They
laughable.
should shoot it again with Sean Connery.
Totally,
It's funny though, as a
totally.
kid, I used to confuse Jodie Foster and Michelle Pfeiffer.
Oh, really?
When I was quite young.
Yeah.
And I think there was a movie with the two of them together, and maybe that's where they were sisters or something. Maybe that's why.
And you caught the cameo.
I did.
Okay.
With George A. Romero, is that what
Yeah.
you're talking about? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's pretty cool. Which actually segues nicely into a discussion
nice,
topic
good.
I have for us if you're into it.
And there's one more cameo before you get into that segue. Did you see the other cameo? It was one of the SWAT cops,
No.
Chris Isaac.
Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe I did actually, now that you mention that.
You probably don't know who
No.
Chris Isaac
No.
is. For you.
Do you know George A. Romero?
No.
He directed the Night of the Living Dead, zombie films.
I don't know. I haven't watched those.
Oh, that's good.
Really?
Not
Okay.
serial killer, but
Okay, so here's my discussion topic. I think this is an edge case, which more than a lot of other films brings up this debate of what is horror and what is not horror.
Yeah.
So we've referred to this as a horror several times. I've heard many people debate that this is not a horror film. It's It's like a crime thriller.
Yeah.
So in your opinion, for both of you, I'm curious, would you characterize this film as a horror film?
For me, no.
Okay.
I had, because in my notes, I have it as a procedural thriller.
But you've referred to it as a horror several times, which is interesting.
Sure, because it comes up in like on people's lists as a horror film, but I don't. We've had this discussion many times. It certainly straddles the line, and there are, I feel like, horror adjacent elements. Right, the idea of a serial killer, it can be horrific.
Mm-hmm.
The whole setup that Buffalo Bill has is borderline, horror film. For me, though, I don't think it goes far enough down that road because it kind of stays up here on the relationship between Lecter and Clarice. And it focuses a lot on the investigation of getting to the serial killer. That's where I draw the line. That's why I don't think it's horror first. It has horror elements, but too much of the film is spent on the procedural getting to the serial killer, which is why I don't think it's a horror film. I think if it was a horror film, it would be switched and we would get far more look from the killer's perspective.
Okay. Do you agree or do you disagree?
I probably have referred to it as a horror film talking, but I honestly don't even think it's close to a horror film.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I don't know. I think like when I think of horror, like one of the first movies that comes to mind is Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I think that, I feel like a lot of serial killer movies I wouldn't consider horror in a way. I think that, the ones that focus on the investigation aspect of it, I think that's thriller, right? I think that it's crime, it's thriller. I think that, there was some there was some aspects of the movie, like there's a little bit of, I wouldn't say gore, but there was, like the pictures of the victims. But I would not consider it I wouldn't consider it horror. No. But I actually have a question for you on that top. Would you consider any of the Scream movies horror?
So I agree. There's a reason this film is an edge case because could go both ways pretty easily. I agree that the mode of the film isn't really horror. Like I think of the scene where she goes into the garage, the storage. There was many, because she's in a dark room,
Totally
looking around. Like they could have had a jump scare, they could have had a cat, they could have had something that was trying to evoke fear from the audience, and it doesn't happen. She just goes straight forward, looks around, finds what she needs. So it never really operates in a mode of trying to scare the audience, I don't think.
Yeah.
In terms of like how a horror film might. The director isn't really known for horror. He's done mostly dramas. He did like Philadelphia and other things. Now there's some gore. I think there's some body horror. Like I think of the cop on the cell. Like to me, that's pushing the boundary of horror quite a bit. Clarice doesn't take any. Oh, actually, I won't say too much about. Yeah, I'll leave that point for now.
So can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes.
Because you've kind of made your statement about whether you think it's horror or not. Because one of the notes that I wrote to myself was, excuse me, I love the procedural serial killer aspects, and I don't think it's been done better with the exception perhaps of Seven. Yes. And so my question to you would be, is Seven a horror film? Or does it fall in the same category as this one?
Yeah, well, to go back to this film, though, 2 points here. In my top 10 of all time, I did put Seven.
Yeah.
And I do feel like Seven is a little bit darker and has a little bit more of a horror mode than this one. I'm pretty comfortable calling Seven a horror film. This is the one I feel like that even is like one step away from that one in terms of horror.
I agree.
The only thing that makes me think that this is a horror film is when you ask any casual moviegoer what their experience was with this film, they talk about how scary and how terrifying it was. Like, my parents said, like, this one of the scariest films I've ever seen is Silence of the Lambs.
Really?
And so I think for people who, well, that's right. So if you are used to watching a lot of horror, you're kind of like, yeah, I don't know if this is a horror film. But if you're a casual moviegoer, I think this movie is scary. And if the movie is scary and terrifying, and that's how you describe it, I can see why it might be considered horror for that reason. And there is, even the fact that George A. Romero makes a cameo in this film, like, why would you have a horror director who did Night of the Living Dead in your film if you're not sort of paying some homage to horror, perhaps. What are your responses to that?
Yeah, I that last point is I'm not sure that I have a response for it. Your previous points about people find different things scary or terrifying, I don't think that defines it that makes it a horror film just because you found it scary. I mean, because you're uncomfortable with elements in the film or because you found you didn't like the gore in a film or whatever and you find that scary, that doesn't make it a horror film. I still think I agree more with your statement about it's the mode in which the film operates the majority of the time that determines whether or not it's a horror film. And I 100% agree with you about Seven. I feel more comfortable calling that a horror film, even though it's set up on the surface as exactly the same thing. It's an investigation into a serial killer. But it's, for example, and this is where I come back to my point, in Seven, you get a lot more insight into the viewpoint from the killer's perspective. You get his notebooks, you get the little notes that he leaves on, behind pictures or here and there. And you also have that darker look to the film.
It's a lot darker, yeah.
Right? And to me, that's what makes it, not to mention the ending. What's in the box?
Yeah. You have to see that movie, by the way.
I know. I need to see it. I haven't even seen it.
I'm sorry if I
Do you
gave
think, though, the
something
fact
away.
that they show a lot from, what's her name, Catherine's perspective, though, in the dungeon, like,
Are we spoiling now? Are we?
is that a spoiler?
Well, if you haven't seen the film, I'm pretty sure it's a spoiler.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
We're going into spoilers.
This is our going into spoilers. We could edit this part out, but
We're a long ways into the conversation, so I think we've done pretty well for not spoiling. So I think we're okay to go into spoilers now.
yeah.
sure, yeah. Spoilers.
Okay, spoilers.
So I just had an upcoming thing spoiled for me.
Yeah, so like the experience of her being in the dungeon and like she's terrified and he's kind of like mocking her and you've got like the cop hung up by the cell and her biting the face. Like it definitely walks the line.
I think this could be a whole topic for like a whole podcast.
Stay tuned. We actually, we may have plans for such a thing. But it's interesting. You can go in different directions, right? Like what is like horror comedy and at what point does it stop being a horror and it's just solely a comedy? And I think, Maddie, your point, which is true, I think a lot of those like serial killer, police procedural, crime thrillers aren't horror. And the two that always come up are Seven and Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah.
And I was trying to look for it. Like I was writing notes on both sides. It's just like, I think I squeak it in as horror just barely.
There's a difference between horrific elements, horrific scenes. You can have a drama with a horrific scene in it. That doesn't make it a horror film.
Agreed. Yeah.
Right? But sorry, I think you might, did you something click for you and you had something to say?
Well, a little bit. Like I remember just now when you were talking about how, both of you were talking about, how normal moviegoers, or however you want to say that, they would, think that this movie is scary and probably classify it as horror. And I was just thinking to myself right then, I was like thinking about the movie that has made me the most scared. And this is really controversial because a bunch of people think it's not scary, but Smile like messed me up. And I would consider that a thriller, not a horror.
Oh, interesting.
And I think, yeah.
But if it messed you up and it scared you, then is it horror?
I just don't know if I
Even in the beginning, I was paying attention when you were talking about when you watched this film.
Yeah.
You referred to it as you're like, this movie messed me up or I was scared or like I don't know. I think this movie scares a lot of people, probably.
I think the first time I watched it, it scared me a little bit. I think like every like horror or thriller movie like scares me a little bit.
Sure.
But like I had to go home and stay home alone after Smile, and my friend was also home alone at her house, but she had like a cat, and I was like, I will pay you $50 to come and spend the night at my house because I am so scared.
I totally get what you're saying. Like there was something about Smile that got under my skin too. Like there's something, there's a creep factor
creepy.
in that one, right? And I can totally appreciate that. Like, and I don't know. I mean, I know that this is the one of the controversial ones that straddles that line, which is why it gets the name of elevated horror.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think how it was marketed, whether like whatever was behind the scenes, I don't know, but marketing this as a thriller to me makes way more sense because it is that procedural kind of thriller film with horrific elements in it. And I mean, I have to wonder in 1991, would somebody like, if you had pitched this to Anthony Hopkins, okay, we've got this serial killer horror film, would he have done it? Or if he read the script and there were more scenes that were more horror style, would that have still appealed to him given the quality of the rest of it if it had remained the same, right?
Because they do show like when he's beating the cop with the stick.
Absolutely.
It's shown off camera though.
Yes.
Jodie Foster doesn't take any damage at the end. Like usually in a horror film, the final girl's like getting cut up and, you know, she manages to overcome in the end, but she just kind of like shoots him and that's the end of it.
In the cage scene, you do see the horror, like it's off. You don't see the prosthetics, what you would see in a horror film, but you see the blood spatter. I mean, you
see the bite.
Yeah, you see the bite. Yep. I mean, and what the scene that got me, I remember the first time I saw it was I refer to it as the face-off scene, where he's lying and you think it's the other cop, right? And then it's like, holy shit, he's taking his face. First of all, then I started getting analytical, but I was like, okay, he's got a penknife, great. How is he going to take off the guy's skin and all the rest of it? But the actual thought of him taking off somebody's skin and wearing it to get out really got me the first time I saw it.
And do you think it becomes more horror the more context you put in this 1991? Like, I think gorehound horror people, maybe this wouldn't have been a big deal, but for a mainstream movie that won Oscars, like...
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to that because, I mean, do you remember... I don't know if you do remember, but do you remember the first time we saw The Devil's Rejects? We didn't see it together, but you and I had a conversation about, like, I remember saying, I don't know if I should have liked that film.
Yeah,
and I felt dirty after watching that film.
100%. Have you seen Devil's Rejects?
No.
Oh, okay.
I gotta list.
So that one, for me, like, if you think, okay, I've seen that film and worse, and then you think back 30 plus years to this, yeah, I think there's an aspect of it was horrific for its time. But even Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I mean, that's part of the lore of that movie is, it's so bloody. No, it isn't. There's hardly any blood in that film. It's all suggested. Mm-hmm. And even the one scene where, can't remember the character's name in the wheelchair, when he's confronted by Leatherface and you see the saw come down, you never see it make contact.
No.
All you see is exactly what you saw in this film is blood spatter coming back on the killer.
So it's true.
So to me, there's an element of that where it's like, it's what we interpose between what we see and what we think we see, right?
Yeah. And I just think of like the amount of people I've talked to who anecdotally, which means nothing, but anecdotally say like this movie was terrifying at the time. Makes me wonder if it's horror. If the main reaction people get from it is fear, then I feel like it's doing more than a lot of horror movies do now. I feel like it succeeds as a horror film.
All good things to those who wait.
That's right. But you're right. I think we both agree the mode of the film is not horror. It plays out like a drama for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, I want to get this in there because I want to get it in there.
More quotes.
It's not more quotes, but I want to talk about music because I already mentioned the American Girl by Tom Petty and that scene. I can't hear that song without seeing the scene of that young woman driving her Volvo and coming. But I also the Goodbye Horses scene with Ted Levine. That song, Goodbye Horses.
Oh, yeah.
That's an incredible scene. And the music, I mean, this time I actually really dug in and listened to the lyrics of the song. Like, that's a fantastic scene. And then the other one that stuck out for me is the classical music in the cage scene.
Totally.
Because they mention, I think it's Chilton, but it might have been Scott Glenn who says, I think it's Chilton who says, he shows her, you never see the picture of the nurse But he says this is what he did to the nurse, and his heart rate never got above 80 or whatever he
Yeah.
says. And
I thought they might show it, but
I was hoping that they would show it.
yeah, they didn't.
because they show a lot of photographs in the film,
Yeah.
graphic things like the
Yeah.
girls being skinned and stuff. But
I just wonder if they thought, well, do we really like that was early
leaving
in
it to the
film.
imagination is
Yeah.
maybe more powerful.
So
you know?
I think early in the film, let's leave it to suggestion because we can fill in something far more graphic and horrific than they could. They'd have to create the thing to do it and then take Polaroids of it or whatever.
Yeah.
I just found the choice of music and when it was played had a significant impact on me. Like I didn't remember except the American Girl one. I didn't remember the music as much. I mean, the Goodbye Horses one is a pretty iconic scene.
So here's a question.
Yeah.
Howard Shore did the soundtrack, or he's the composer for the film. Does that person then also choose the other music that goes in the film, even if they don't compose it?
That's a good question. My understanding, and I don't know if it's the same for every film, is no.
So that's the director's call.
Well, I think if I didn't look through the credits,
Yeah.
I think you would have, I don't know if they have like Key Grip, if they have a name, but you would have a consultant
Right.
who did the music. And I've seen those people interviewed and they have like encyclopedic knowledge of like, they look at a scene and they go, I know what's going to. Now, sometimes what it amounts to is, can they afford to license it for
That's
the
fair.
film?
Yeah.
And because this is a big budget film, you got Tom Petty. Although maybe, 91, Tom Petty was still, they were a thing, but they weren't as iconic as they are now. But the Goodbye Horses, I think that was a flash in the pan. Like, I shouldn't say that. Sorry if there's any, who did that one anyway? Lazarus is the name of the group that did that. So if you're a big fan, my apologies. I don't recall anything else by Lazarus in the last 30 years, but I could be mistaken. But yeah, I just think, I think because I have a music background and because that always tweaks me a little bit is, how are they using music? Like, what are they, and I love the juxtaposition between, particularly in the cage scene, between the beauty of the classical music and his drawings and his composure, right? You see him breathing and then hitting the guy and then breathing and hitting the guy. And I just love that. I love the contrast between his control and the beauty that you hear and the beauty that's suggested by his drawings and the absolute savagery with which
It's like the paradox of Hannibal Lecter. Like, that's what makes him such a compelling character,
right?
I think.
Yeah.
Because, you can have your crazy, just nut bar serial killers who are, but I think it's that marriage of sophistication and savagery that really works.
Such a good choice.
I feel like you would be the type of person where you'd sit down with dinner with him and you'd have like 8 different utensils, and if you use the wrong one, you get a dirty look.
Have you seen Hannibal?
No.
So that's the sequel. There's a few dinner scenes, and you should actually watch that one. He may
Really?
actually do that. You might get the answer to your question.
I haven't seen every sequel, but my understanding is they got progressively worse.
Hannibal is not very good.
Yeah.
unfortunately. Red Dragon I like quite a bit. With Edward Norton.
Is that with
Edward Norton?
Edward Norton, yeah.
That's a good one.
The novels are actually quite good. I read the Thomas Harris novels before I ever saw the films. I read those in the 80s because I was Book of the Month Club geek. I think the TV series is better than the subsequent films.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Have you seen? I can't remember the TV series.
No.
No. Okay.
Oh, again, so good because they've got Mads Mikkelsen is Hannibal, and very similarly, although a very different style of actor, but I think he has the composure and the confidence to play the character in a way that's believable.
He kind of pulls off that dynamic we were just talking about. I think the
Yeah.
sophistication and the savagery.
Yeah.
Did you like the ending, Maddie?
You know what? I did like the ending. I liked how at the end I feel like when I was watching it, I kind of forgot about him. You get
get so caught up in the Buffalo Bill stuff. Yeah, that's true.
You
Once he
kinda-
escapes.
And then you kind of forget about him. You're like, oh my God, that's him in the ambulance, whatever. And then you kind of forget about him for a bit.
Yeah.
And then he calls her and then you're like, oh my God, right. He's out there.
Yeah.
I think it was really funny. What was it? I'm having an old friend for dinner.
Yeah, that's such a
Yeah,
good
yeah.
line.
It was
Such
so
a good
good.
line.
And then you see who it is.
Yeah.
And that guy's a dick the whole movie.
Yeah.
Totally.
Which is, that's why I think you kind of, like, you're rooting, I feel like you're rooting for
Yeah.
Hannibal Lecter. Like, at the end, you're like, yeah, like, go get that guy and carve him up and eat his face. Like, even though he's doing evil things. Maybe that's just me.
Well, no, I agree. What is it like? What's that? Dex?
Dexter?
Yeah.
Dexter. The
Dexter.
serial killer
Yeah.
who kills.
Yes.
Other serial killers.
Yeah. It's like the same sort of
Yeah.
thing, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, and you see that a lot though within just like, real life serial killers is, they kill quite often they're not actually bad people, but what their vision is of, sinners, right? And they want to rid society of sinners. Who is the Robert Pickton?
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I remember reading about how, he went for hookers and whatnot because he was like, they don't mean anything to society, whatever, which is super unfortunate because, at the end of the day, no matter who you are, what position you're in, you're like, everyone's still human, right?
Mhm.
But it kind of, he has that bit of the element of like, like I'm going to eat the people that,
I think you're like, I agree with you that often serial killers have constructed a morality
yeah.
In their minds.
within which they kill, right? Like this is okay, but this isn't, right? And that I think that's Lecter fits into
And
that.
based
for
on what
sure.
you just said, you have to watch Seven now. Like, it's just,
I know.
it's
You
so
know what?
good.
Yes.
Maybe I'll watch it. Maybe I'll watch it tonight actually. But and you know what I think though is that the morality. I think that ties in with the sophisticatedness and the intelligence.
Yeah.
Because you look at like super messy, like crazy serial killers that just go on like killing sprees for no reason and kind of have like tunnel vision in the sense that they just kill anything with two legs in front of them.
Yeah.
And then you see, the serial killers that actually like carefully, pick out their victims, or at least they have like a system when it comes to like Ted Bundy, for example, right? There's serial killer Henry. I'm gonna get wrapped up in serial killers. There's Henry Lee Miller, and he killed like I think it was, I might be wrong, estimated over 200 people, and he was just killing people.
That's crazy.
He was
Yeah.
just killing people. But for him, the morality for him, the part of it was he turned himself in, helped solve all the crimes, so he could get the electric chair to go be with one of the girls he killed in heaven or hell or wherever because he really liked her and he regretted killing her. So he wanted to go
interesting.
back to her. So
Wow.
there's a picture of him about to get the electric chair and he has the biggest, like a kid on Christmas smile on his face. It is
Wow.
crazy. And he actually got hit on the head by his mother with a 2x4 when he was younger. So he's like got some.
Yeah, that might
That
explain.
explains
Yeah.
a few things. Yeah.
Right?
See, she knows a lot about serial killers.
Did you? I don't know if you paid attention to some of these things, but there were a few visual things that I really appreciated this time that I noticed. One is in one of the interview scenes. It's just one of my favorite scenes is where you see Clarice through the glass.
I wrote that down.
But you see Hannibal's reflection.
Yes.
It is so good.
That was brilliant.
Like that is so well done, and I also love the doorbell cuts later in the film when you think like they're ramping up the tension.
Oh, I wrote that down too.
and you think that because I remember that getting me the first time I saw it. Is they're
Yeah.
going to get Buffalo Bill, and then it's like, oh, that's not Scott Glenn's character.
Because they make you think the SWAT team is
100%.
closing in and already and the doorbell's ringing, like, oh, like that was really clever. I think that's one of the best elements of this film. Kind of works the way they do it with him wearing the face in the ambulance too. Like they
Absolutely, yeah.
some trickery there to make you
And
think
the other,
otherwise.
I mean, the other thing that I really liked is the final scene with Buffalo Bill and the night vision goggles. The sound design. I watched it this time with earphones on. The sound design in that scene is so good. And it's to me when I watched it, it's palpable. Like when he reaches out and he wants to touch her. And Jodie Foster is so good at acting through that fear. You see it through that night vision lens, and she looks terrified.
See,
in
that scene to me felt like a horror scene. Like, I feel like you are
Yes.
like terrified for her. Like, that's where the first half of the film operates more as a drama. And I feel as the film goes on, starts to actually go into that horror mode a little bit. Because that scene in particular, I wrote down, like, this feels like a horror movie at this point.
Yeah, I mean, particularly the last few scenes of the film where she breaks the window and there's the body in the
Because
bathtub.
there's that tension. Like, he sees her, she can't see him, he's reaching out. Yeah.
And I mean, it's resolved quite nicely. And I like too how they play with the tension of, Jodie Foster's saying to the young woman in the pit, the other agents are on their way. Get me the fuck out of here. Don't leave me here, you bitch.
I actually thought you should just leave her there. Like, she's coming to rescue you. You're going to swear at her and call her
Yeah.
names. Like, I was almost like, oh, wow,
Okay,
you're out
you
of
can
place.
stay down there.
Yeah.
Puts the lotion in the basket.
Yeah.
But there's so like that. There's such a nice interplay there between, I won't call it comedy, but some black comedy. With what's the character's name in the pit? The senator's daughter.
Yes,
Can't remember.
Catherine.
Catherine. She, when she's trying to get the dog, and then when she gets the dog, and like all of
That's
those
really smart, by
things-
the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's just I think as much as I don't like the term elevated horror, I mean, I think that's what elevates it is those elements that are so well done that are often overlooked in your run-of-the-mill kind of horror film.
This will have to be a debate for another day. I don't necessarily hate that term, but it's already a long episode. We'll have to save that one for a future one, but that's interesting.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, we'll save it for another day.
It would have been interesting to see how that played out because she gets the dog and then he goes off and grabs a gun. But then Jodie Foster shows up. And so you don't get to see, like, I was really curious to know how that would play out. Because he probably wants his dog to live.
Totally.
I was like, he's just gonna shoot her.
Yeah.
So I mean,
Like, would he have let her go if it meant him saving his dog? Or, I don't know, I just was curious to see how that would have played out. We never got to see. But
yeah, I don't. I think the body in the bathtub. I think that was definitely an aspect of horror for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
That was Mrs. whoever it was, whose house he had taken over.
Yeah.
yes.
But yeah, I mean, there are, coming back to that conversation, there are certainly horror elements. I just don't think it operates on that level enough of the time to make it a horror film.
No, that's fair. Yeah.
But
And one thing we talked about a lot over the last couple seasons, how much your expectations plays in.
Yeah.
So you going into this, having it had recommended, did you go in expecting this movie's going to be really good?
Well, I mean, you recommended it, and usually the movies you recommend are pretty good. So,
except for Nicolas Cage films, I'm gonna say that.
so I going in and I thought it was gonna be good. And honestly, like even just the name, I was like, okay, like this should be good. And I really liked it the first time. I think it's definitely on my list for sure of my top favorite movies. I think, and I think the biggest reason for me is because I'm so into psychology, and it just really shows how intelligent, smart, and calculated, and also how messy serial killers that can be. And what it makes me think is like now if you look at like the population, and if you think about like how many psychopaths are actually like out there.
Apparently 30% of all corporate CEOs are like diagnosable psychopaths.
100%. I was talking to my dad about that because he owns a company, and you know what, like he totally agrees. And it's a specific mindset that can lead to being really successful in business. I mean, like look at like American Psycho, right?
For sure.
Right?
Doesn't mean that every psychopath is a serial killer.
No.
But that they do
No.
have that lack of empathy and that drive, and like I'm willing to do whatever I have to do to get to the top. Yeah.
Or like a sociopath, for example.
Yeah.
But I think that it just makes me think like, oh my gosh, like how many people are out there that actually
Maybe you're a psychopath.
maybe.
I'm going to do a little plug for, speaking of psychopaths, for another podcast that I've been listening to. I think this is their third season, called The Lazarus Project.
Oh, I've heard of that one actually.
So this season is on Tesla and Elon Musk. And if you want to hear about a psychopath running a company. So anyway, a shout out to the creators of The Lazarus Project, because it's a very well done podcast, and I really like it.
I'll also shout out Morbid is all about different serial killers, and they talk about them and do the usually multi-episode things. So if you're really into serial killers, Morbid's a good podcast.
Ah, nice. I'll write that down because
Yeah.
I haven't come
They
across
do one
that
on Picton. They do one on
Wow.
Homolka
Those are different
and
seasons or just single episodes on each one?
single episodes in some cases, but they're really not. Like I think Picton gets 3.
Wow.
And the Ken and Barbie killer, like Robert Bernardo, like I think they get a
Wow.
couple. Is there one like the Toy Box? Have you heard of the Toy Box?
No.
Oh my, it is messed up. Yeah, it's a pretty hardcore podcast, but it's good.
Okay.
That's awesome.
You probably, I thought maybe
yeah,
you've heard that
yeah.
one already, but
I'll have to. I definitely. I've been getting into podcasts more with all the traveling, so I'll definitely have to check that one out.
we're great for
sure.
traveling. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
So I think we've been at this probably an hour-ish at this rate.
Well, I would think so.
So should we
a little
maybe give
longer.
our
give our listeners a break?
give our final. Sounds like you hate this movie, but how would you recommend this film?
If you haven't seen this, how is it possible that you haven't seen this film? I don't care how old you are. Go watch it. Do it. Maddie, she's like 80 years younger than me, and she's watched this film. That was her choice. It's so good. Go watch it. 100%.
Maddie, do you agree?
I think go watch it. I think watch it 2 times. That's my recommendation.
Nice.
Watch it once, and then watch it again, and just really watch it and enjoy it. I think there's a really enjoyable.
And back-to-back watchings. Like, watch it,
Yeah.
go to the bathroom, get another drink,
Take a break.
and then come back.
Right
I
back.
think it's okay. It would have been better if Nicolas Cage had been cast as
Yeah.
Hannibal Lecter. No, it's an amazing film. You really I have nothing negative to say about this movie. It's very good.
Yeah, I mean, I was so excited actually that Maddie chose it because I haven't watched this in so long. It'd be so cool. And then as I was watching it, it was just one thing after another that was such a positive, like from every aspect, from the performances, the visuals. Like it's not a cinematic film in like cinematography, but there's all these visual elements that are so well done, and there's the music things, and there's sound design, and it's just such a
It's the
great
total
film.
package.
Yeah, totally.
And I think you could go in with high expectations and it would still deliver, I think.
I feel like it would.
Which is kind of what I was getting at when I was asking Maddie about that. So
If you go in with high expectations and it doesn't deliver, then you need to question yourself.
Yeah.
Like, how did you? Yeah, sorry.
and if you love Silence of the Lambs, you should watch Seven as well, because it's
Absolutely.
similar to this and also amazing. So Maddie, is there anything you would like to plug? She has a very cool side career gig thing, which she could talk about.
Oh, well, I mean, aside from being an avid serial killer lover, speaking of feminism and how that played a role in this movie, I'm a female race car driver. I drive for Honda at a circuit down in the States. If you want to follow it, or if you're interested in cars or anything at all, or if you're watching this and you also like horrific things and cars, and want to reach out or ask any questions about how to get into it, my Instagram is maddyy.lemke.
And I will post that in the description as well.
Perfect. And yeah.
And you have a race coming up in October, you said?
Yeah, my first pro race is October at Indianapolis Motor Speedway, which is very
That's awesome.
famous.
What kind of vehicle? Sorry to interrupt. What are you driving?
So I'm driving. It's a 2022 Honda Civic Si body. Honda Performance Development out of Los Angeles. They took 9 of them, I believe, and they made them into race cars for this series. They're called touring cars, so TCA cars is what they're identified in the racing world. And so it looks kind of not really like a Honda Civic Si, like the similar body type, but it's a full little race car. So
Very cool.
What color is it?
it's black and green,
Nice.
right? Yeah, no, it's
You should get a Hannibal Lecter like bumper sticker to put on the back.
Totally.
yeah,
That'd be
we have so when we got the car, it was just white, and I started calling her Betty White.
That's so good.
And then it got wrapped, and now it's black and green, so we call it Black Betty. But we're getting like a little sticker made of Betty White's signature, and we're gonna put it like a super small spot on the
Oh, that's
car.
perfect. That's awesome.
Right?
And maybe make up your own like serial killer's rule or something like that to put on the back
Something.
bumper. Yeah,
They need
something
something on there.
that might scare your opponents actually when they're behind you, which I'm sure they are for most of the race. So when they're behind you and they see your bumper, it says serial killer's rule. That might scare them.
Ted
into just-
Bundy.
yeah.
Maybe one day they'll make a movie about like a race car driver serial killer.
I was going to recommend you could choose Christine about the killer car, but
Yeah,
There you go.
that's true.
anyways, thank you very much to Maddie for coming on to
Yes,
discuss
thank you.
this amazing
That was
film,
awesome.
Silence of the
Great
Lambs.
choice.
Thanks for listening, everyone, and
And
we'll see you in the aisles.